Get out of that seat." The flight attendant's voice cut through the first-class cabin, sharp and unyielding. The businessman in 2B had been complaining for 10 minutes, his face red with indignation as he pointed at the elderly man in military uniform sitting quietly in 2A. "I paid full price for this flight. I shouldn't have to sit next to someone who probably got a pity upgrade." The old man, 72 with silver hair and a dress uniform that looked like it had seen better days, gathered his small carry-on without argument, his hands steady despite the humiliation. The flight attendant guided him toward the back, toward coach, while other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence. If you believe dignity should never be stripped away like luggage, comment respect in the chat. Captain Douglas Barnes, though nobody on United Flight 447 knew to call him captain, had flown this route hundreds of times, but never as a passenger. He'd retired from the Air Force 6 years ago, transitioning to commercial aviation briefly before age and changing regulations pushed him into full retirement. The uniform he wore was for his grandson's commissioning ceremony in Colorado Springs, a proud moment he'd been looking forward to for months. He'd used miles for the first-class ticket, something he rarely did, wanting just once to experience the comfort he'd spent decades helping to engineer. The Boeing 777 was a plane he knew intimately. He'd been part of the test flight program, had helped write portions of the emergency procedures manual, had logged more hours in this specific aircraft model than most current pilots would achieve in their entire careers. The businessman's complaints had started the moment Barnes settled into his seat. Comments about military discounts ruining premium travel, about how those people should stay in their own section. The flight attendant, young and overwhelmed by the aggressive passenger, had made a judgment call prioritizing the loudest voice over quiet dignity. Barnes hadn't fought it. He never did. He'd simply stood, nodded politely, and followed her to 24C, a middle seat between a mother with a restless toddler and a teenager with headphones. He stowed his bag, buckled in, and closed his eyes, trying to ignore the sting of being treated like his service, his expertise. His very presence was somehow worth less than a businessman's comfort. Around him, coach passengers whispered, some having witnessed the move, others catching second-hand details. A few looked angry on his behalf. Most looked away, the familiar discomfort of witnessing injustice without intervention. The flight reached cruising altitude smoothly. Barnes felt the subtle shift in engine tone that most passengers never noticed, the tiny variations that spoke of a well-maintained aircraft performing exactly as designed. Then, 40 minutes into the flight, he felt something else. A hydraulic pressure fluctuation, barely perceptible, the kind of thing that could be nothing, or could be everything. His eyes opened. He waited, listening. There it was again, more pronounced this time. The teenage next to him noticed him tense. "You okay, sir?" Barnes nodded, but his mind was racing through system diagrams, backup protocols, emergency procedures he'd helped develop for precisely this kind of scenario. Then the PA system crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mitchell. We're experiencing a minor technical issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Minor technical issue. The phrase that covered everything from a faulty coffee maker to catastrophic system failure. Barnes heard it in the pilot's voice, the careful control, the slight tension underneath. Hydraulic failure, he'd bet his pension on it. Probably redundant systems, nothing immediately dangerous, but enough to make a pilot sweat. The plane began a gentle turn, likely heading back to Denver. Then something unexpected. The flight attendant from before appeared, moving quickly through coach, scanning seat numbers. She stopped at row 24, her face pale. "Captain Douglas Barnes?" Barnes raised his hand slightly. Her voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "The pilots need you in the cockpit immediately." Every head in coach turned. The businessmen in first class, visible through the cabin divider, looked confused. The walk to the cockpit felt surreal. Passengers stared as Barnes moved forward, no longer the unwanted presence to be relegated to cheaper seats, but something else entirely. The flight attendant who'd moved him wouldn't meet his eyes. At the cockpit door, she knocked the emergency sequence. Captain Mitchell himself opened it, his face flooding with relief when he saw Barnes. "Thank God you're on this flight. We've got dual hydraulic failure, backup system showing intermittent, and the manual procedures are—" He trailed off, gesturing to the thick emergency binder open on the console. Barnes stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning the instruments, seeing the problem with the clarity of someone who'd lived through every possible scenario in test conditions. That manual was designed for the original system configuration. You're flying the upgraded variant. Different valve sequence. Mitchell's co-pilot looked between them, confused. "You two know each other?" Mitchell's laugh was slightly hysterical. "Know each other? This is Douglas Eagle Barnes. He test flew the first production 777, wrote half the emergency procedures we're supposed to be following, and certified every pilot in our fleet for 5 years. Captain Barnes, what do we do?" Barnes was already at the engineer's station, his fingers moving across backup controls with practiced ease. "First, ignore steps 3 through 7 in that manual. They don't apply to your hydraulic configuration. Your backup system isn't failing. It's overwhelmed because the primary shutdown protocol is fighting it. We added a manual override in the ASO 8, upgrade specifically for this." His hands moved to a panel, flipping switches in a sequence that wasn't in any current manual. Immediately, the hydraulic pressure stabilized. The cockpit instruments settled into normal ranges. Captain Mitchell exhaled a breath he'd been holding for minutes. "How did you know that sequence? That's not in our training." Barnes straightened, his back protesting decades-old injuries. "Because I designed it after we had this exact failure during test flight 347. The manual update was supposed to go fleet-wide in 2010, but budget cuts meant only new aircraft got the documentation. Your plane is a 2008 model, so you have the hardware fix but not the paper trail. I've been trying to get United to update their procedures for years." The co-pilot was staring at him with something approaching awe. "You've been trying to tell us how to save our own lives, and nobody listened." Barnes shrugged. "I'm retired. Retired people get a lot of polite nods and very little action, until moments like this." Captain Mitchell's voice came over the PA, steady now, professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to report our technical issue has been resolved. We'll continue to Denver as planned. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize a very special passenger. Captain Douglas Eagle. Barnes, United States Air Force retired. Former Boeing test pilot, the man who literally wrote the emergency procedures that just kept us safe, is on board today. Captain Barnes is a Medal of Honor recipient, a lifetime platinum member of United Airlines, and—" his voice caught slightly. "He's also the pilot who flew rescue operations in Iraq, including the mission that saved my life when I was shot down in 2004. I didn't know he was on this flight. I'm grateful beyond words that he was." The cabin erupted. Not in applause. This wasn't a movie. But in a wave of stunned silence followed by whispered conversations, people craning to see, the teenager in 24D staring at the man who'd been sitting next to him with wide eyes. The flight attendant who'd moved Barnes stood near first class, her face stricken. When Barnes emerged from the cockpit, she approached him, tears streaming. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. He was complaining and I just—" Barnes touched her arm gently. "You made a choice under pressure. We all do. Learn from it. Judge people by their character, not by whether they have money to silence discomfort." She nodded, unable to speak. The businessman in 2B had gone very quiet, very small. Captain Mitchell escorted Barnes back through the cabin, not to coach, but to first class, personally removing the businessman's belongings from the overhead bin. I think you'll be more comfortable in 24C, Mitchell said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Barnes spent the rest of the flight in 2A, the seat he'd paid for with miles earned through decades of service. Passengers came by in a steady stream, thanking him, shaking his hand, asking for stories. He answered graciously, but quietly, never quite comfortable with attention. The teenager from 24D came up, nervous. "Sir, you just saved everyone on this plane and you are sitting in a middle seat like it was nothing. That's the most badass thing I've ever seen." Barnes smiled. Service doesn't stop being service because circumstances change. You do what needs doing, regardless of recognition. That's the only way to live with yourself. When they landed in Denver, the entire flight crew stood at attention as passengers deplaned, rendering salutes to the man who'd been deemed unworthy of his seat hours earlier. The businessman left quickly, head down, avoiding all eye contact. Barnes helped the mother from coach carry her toddler's bags through the terminal, disappearing into the crowd like he'd never been anything special at all. Subscribe to my channel if you believe true worth reveals itself in crisis, not in peacetime. Douglas Barnes didn't demand respect, didn't waive his credentials, didn't fight for dignity when it was stripped away. He simply did what he'd always done, served others, solved problems, and proved that character isn't about where you sit or what you wear. It's about who you become when nobody's watching, and who you remain when everyone is. Honor the quiet professionals who built the systems that keep us safe, who wrote the manuals that save lives, who never stopped serving even after their service officially ended. The next time you're tempted to judge someone by their appearance, remember that the person you dismiss might be the only one who can save you when everything goes wrong.